Hi there. This is the E.M.I for the month of January 2026. So let's jump right in. In this month's E.M.I, as usual, we ask a few questions. Have India's fiscal cycles witnessed very different macro backdrops? How realistic is it to look up to the centre's annual budget exercise for a boost? Why are markets invariably focused on centre's capex projections in every single budget? Must the centre fiscally consolidate when they can comfortably ease? India's fiscal cycles have witnessed very different macro dynamics. The annual budget exercise of the central government has always focused on the fiscal deficit. From now on, the central government's focus would shift to the debt to GDP metric instead. India has had elevated fiscal deficits for a long time in the past, and this has led to excessive government borrowing, long term debt unsustainability, and inflationary pressures alongside this. To address all of this, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, or FRBM, was introduced in 2003 to bring fiscal discipline and macroeconomic stability. And since then, every emergency fiscal deficit rise has been followed by long phases of fiscal consolidation. However, while fiscal expansion phases are seen to be more or less similar, fiscal consolidation phases have not shared the same macroeconomic dynamic. After touching 9.2% of GDP during the pandemic, the centre has been attempting to normalize its fiscal deficit and by end FY26 would have consolidated by 480 basis points in 5 years. This extent of consolidation is much more than the 310 basis points fiscal consolidation the centre achieved in the last phase over a much longer time span of 9 years. One key difference is that the current consolidation has seen lower nominal GDP growth, a resultant drop in revenues, and the need to contract expenditures as a result. One interesting bit that stands out though is that capex nevertheless appears to have seen growth. Annual budgets provide limited room for discretionary spending. Debt markets and equity markets witness increased activity and expectations in the run up to the centre's annual budget exercise for very different reasons. While debt markets initially keep a close eye on the fiscal deficit and the implied borrowing this would lead to, equity markets, on the other hand, look for evident growth impulses. The centre's budget exercise is very important for the direction it sets, the nuances it adds, and what it implies for India's growth outlook in the near term. However, it is very important to keep in mind that more than 50% of the centre's expenditure goes towards committed spends like interest payments, pensions, salaries, various establishment expenditure, and subsidies. If one were to add another layer of base level capital expenditure of various departments, this leaves us with just above 30% of spends towards spending on various schemes of the government. Now, to this mix, if one were to add key spends on agriculture and rural development ministries, the centre now has less than 25% of its total expenditure to spend on any discretionary purposes. One must remember that lower nominal GDP growth, like we have witnessed in the last 5 years, reduces tax revenues and increases the centre's reliance on non-tax sources. This explains what we have witnessed in the centre's increased reliance on various non-tax sources like dividends from the RBI, financial institutions, public sector companies, etc. Market focus is always on capex spending, the fiscal's traditional punching bag. What does that mean? Apart from searching for a growth impetus in the budget for the very short term, markets also look for credibility in the nominal GDP growth assumption. Long term growth momentum for India lies in the centre's capex push to just the extent needed for pump priming private sector capex momentum. Now, why is there so much focus on capex? Consider this. Center plus state capex is extremely important for the growth of the country. Research pegs the capex multiplier on growth ranging 1.3 to 2.5x with sustained impact up to 4 years and above. However, various macroeconomic and political compulsions have made center and state capex a traditional punching bag, invariably bearing the brunt of cuts during fiscal pressure. While the last couple of years have witnessed capex underperforming, the last decade on average has more often exceeded capex projections. Centre's capex is seen to have given maximum priority to two key sectors, railways and roadways, accounting for 52% of capex spends from 20% in FY12. This has resulted in a directional drop in defense capex over the years to 17% in FY25 from nearly one-third in FY19. The question at hand is if political uncertainties could bring focus back to this sector. The next question that keeps coming up is why the center must fiscally consolidate when they can comfortably ease. Why must the center fiscally consolidate at a time of global uncertainty? Why can't the center loosen its purse strings at a time when India is faced with high tariffs? The answer to these questions are two-pronged. Post 2003, India has spent 3/4 of its time in fiscal consolidation. Revenue streams, therefore, are of great importance and determine the quality of fiscal consolidation. Constrained revenues clubbed with lower growth exert excessive pressure on spending, leading to sharp cuts. And therefore, any one-off fiscal easing the center would be pushed to do, like we saw during the financial crisis and the pandemic, would put a strain on the political economy dynamics. Why? Because cutting back spending on key schemes are not very easy. And therefore, like we mentioned earlier, the axe tends to come down on capex. The last decade has seen a very different fiscal dynamic. 60% of the last decade has seen the center act in a counter-cyclical way, lending fiscal impetus only during phases of weak underlying economic growth. In other words, only when underlying growth is lower than the trend growth rate. India is playing the long game, looking to structurally bring down its fiscal deficit and with it the need to dominate borrowing and directionally lower market yields. Contrary to short-term thinking on fiscal expansion, increased uncertainties call for more macro stability and sustained long-term budget discipline. Fiscal consolidation is always a drag on growth in the short term. But in the long term, it crowds in private investment, eases interest burden, and keeps inflation in check. And finally, a shift to debt to GDP from fiscal consolidation would give the center appreciable breathing room for spends when India's nominal growth mean reverts. And that was your E.M.I for the month of January 2026. Till next time, this is Arjun signing off.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.